Greetings. Welcome to the fifth lecture of our ongoing course exploring universal history from the standpoint of open versus closed systems, battle of ideas, and specifically ideas that pertain to human beings, our nature, the structure of the universe that we were created into, and whether that universe is fundamentally organized by a principle of death and decay in such a way that it would be considered or assumed to be closed, or whether said universe is living, animated by a principle of reason, creativity, and is thus inclined to constant self-perfectibility, or otherwise termed, leaping over the limits to growth. In previous lectures, we have explored this from a variety of angles, geopolitical, economic, and from the standpoint of the battle over the United States and the study of history per se. In this class, I believe that though this was not originally part of my plan, the previous two lectures demand that this story continue in this way to show the context in which the dynamic of 1776 was able to emerge in the way that it did by going back into a deeper history in the battle over the sovereign nation state per se. So what I will do is begin with a sweeping overview of some of the singularities, the exceptional moments or pregnant moments throughout human history, going back again over 2,000 years into the past with a look towards the battle of various human beings and movements which have emerged at various times, perhaps clothed with different cultures, but always animated by the same concept that human beings are made in the image of a living, reasonable creator, and that all other systems that presume human beings to be simply our sum total of sense perceptions and fleshly impulses are incorrect. Those lower order systems, which have been oligarchical, imperial, exploitative, and premised around master-slave relationships, must be overthrown, say those who represent this higher transcendental mode of thinking. And we're going to look today at some of those and some of the policies that shape the contours of history in a very specific way. So without further ado, I'm going to now share my slideshow. So I've chosen to title today's lecture, The Birth of the Modern Nation State, and featured on that image that I have selected is a representation and homage painted in 1648 representing the Peace of Westphalia, a very important singularity, a shifting moment in world history which brought in the modern nation state as we know it. The figures there represent leading German, principally members of the Catholic and Protestant faiths who had spent over 30 years in constant war, a devastating, never-ending war, which finally came to an end through this specific treaty. Now, over recent years, we have heard the likes of the late Sir Henry Kissinger, Tony Blair, and many others describe the need to leave and exit the Westphalian system. Of course, referring to, in the case of both of those men, the need to restore what they call a might makes right or responsibility to protect doctrine promoted by such figures as Lord Mark Malloch Brown, George Soros, and the hegemonists who have been utilizing banking and military power of the Anglo-American alliance to impose the will of a minority of elites onto the broad base of the world's population through force. So what is this Westphalian system that Blair, Soros, Malloch Brown, Kissinger have said we must exit? Well, we're going to explore that because when we do, we will come to see that there is a very important lesson to be learned. And that lesson will begin with part one, the principle of justice, might versus right. Or, as Sun Yat-sen, the first president of China, had said that it is time that we leave a world of might makes right versus and enter into a more mature stage of humanity whereby right makes might. Featured in that image in the background now is the painting by Raphael D'Estanzio of the School of Athens featuring Plato and Aristotle, his interlocutor, um, who represent two very opposing philosophies about the nature of humankind, the nature of our mind, and the nature of God and creation, and how specifically we relate to that creation in which we were created. And of course, Plato is holding in this his Timaeus, while Aristotle is holding his ethics, Nicomachean ethics. The founders of the American Republic, just as those who led in the orchestration of the Peace of Westphalia and the earlier Florentine Renaissance, which ended the Dark Age, the collapse of population across Europe into devastation, war, plague, starvation. Those figures who I've alluded to in previous lectures and who we will continue to explore in this lecture and further ones were Platonists. They were followers and utilizers of the method of thinking extolled and developed by Plato in his many dialogues, and specifically when considering the political application of Plato's thoughts. Many of these, and I would say probably all of those, especially who came after the Golden Renaissance, had deeply studied paradoxes and thought experiments laid out in Plato's Republic as a dialogue over the question of, well, how does justice manifest, which is not about how necessarily simply one organizes a state, rather how one expresses justice within the law and how we create laws that are reflections of God's divine will, and how do we practically create institutions which transmit a culture that can create philosopher kings or transform kings into philosophers at the same time. Now, in the course of Plato's brilliant exposition of the Republic, he takes the reader through a series of experiments by first beginning with a battle between Socrates and Thrasymachos. Thrasymachos in Book One representing the oligarchical ethos, the Nietzschean ethos of might makes right being the source of justice or definition. And he who can satisfy his pleasures while punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends is he who wields justice the best, says Thrasymachos. Socrates, however, demonstrates through a dialectic process that there are profound paradoxes within Thrasymachos' theory, namely that in many instances, the laws that prevent the oligarchy from being able to engage in license to do what they will is itself created by movements of human beings whom the oligarchy sees as inferior to their higher elite strata. Now, Thrasymachos believes that the masses thus are inferior, and yet the masses who have created laws and customs to keep to impose forces of constricting conscience onto our passions have yet still a power over the superior oligarchy, which Thrasymachos sees himself to be a part of, meaning that the oligarchy would not actually be superior if they have suffered to be imposed by the inferior will. So this is just one of many paradoxes built up. But the question then it still remains, well, what is justice if it isn't what Thrasymachos defines it to be? And Plato weaves various stories of how we grow a society, how that society is able to build an economy, grow, create abundance. And at times he makes a point in Book 2, Book 3, as that early society goes from hunter-gatherer to mercantile, building up trade crafts and what have you, building more abundance, they will grow in territory and may come to the boundary of another people, another territory, another city, at which point we may have to go to war or how do we avoid war? How do we create peaceful relations? And he basically built up his dialogue around how do we create guardians, leaders who are capable of deciding what is just, how do we initiate a just war or a just peace, and how do we initiate or administer justice per se through those laws. And he also points out that if we don't solve this problem, society will forever be locked into systems that cyclically go from democracy into anarchy into complete chaos, which forces a response of order being imposed that leads to tyranny, that creates tension by being tyrannical, being oligarchical, which results in a pressure cooker that explodes of revolution into anarchy and so on and so forth forever, unless we can solve this problem, which he alludes to without giving, as he never does, a crystallized answer. He challenges his readers to think about where the fallacies are in his dialogue. One of those fallacies that I must say is based upon his presumption that human beings, those guardians that will need to be trained, must be bred like animals. Not the logic of how a human being breeds dogs to guard our house is the same logic that can be extended directly into the human domain to breed leaders. And thus, there will be certain fascist consequences if we don't evaluate a qualitative difference between man and lower forms of animal life, which is the substance of all of his dialogues, including the special first book of Republic. So all that to say, these ideas inspired many creative strategists throughout the centuries, but it did not get a chance to take hold until much later. And even there, whenever we saw that representatives of the Platonic school were able to actualize power, too often it was short-lived, and the institutions that they created to advance human progress were undermined and sabotaged by forces who were beholden to a very different philosophy. One of the followers of Plato during the time that Rome was slipping out of its republican traditions and beginning to slide into the corruption of empire was a figure who was named Cicero. And Cicero, at different times, acted in a very high status within the Roman government and always made the point when those around him attempted to define what he was as being either a Stoic or an Epicurean, he always said, I am neither one of those, although he had friends and allies who considered themselves Stoics on the one side and Epicureans on the other. He said he always instead defined himself as a Platonist, as a follower of Plato throughout his laws, his book on Commonwealth, and many of the Platonic dialogues he often wrote in the form not of didactic treatises, Platonic dialogues, knowing that that is the way to engage in the creative powers of a reader who is expected to use active thinking and generating hypotheses in order to be sovereign and not simply memorize finished answers and then repeat, which is not using mind, it is simply using memory. Of course, just to be clear, the Stoic philosophy was one which tended to cripple the emotional state, the liberated emotional state needed for human sovereign thinking to occur. You need to have free emotions, where the Stoics would rely too much, Cicero believed, on the matter of duty, of cold, formalistic rules that governed behavior and decision making. The Epicureans, on the other hand, were making errors in the opposite direction, sabotaging the powers of reason in favor of a moral philosophy that had deep philosophical and metaphysical implications that over accentuated pleasure. Pleasure not of the higher sort, but of the lower sorts, which again disrupted the needed harmony of the inner city, the inner republic that is the metaphor of each of our souls and hearts and minds that must be taught in time to work together for individuals to be truly wise and thus capable of manifesting philosopher kings in the truest sense of the word. So in his laws, those parts of his laws at least that have been preserved, Cicero, who like Socrates earlier was assassinated, was murdered by forces that preferred his way of thinking to not be permitted in that society. But Cicero wrote that even if virtue is weighed according to its gains, not according to its own nature, there will be one virtue which will most correctly be called badness. Insofar as each man judges what to do according to his own convenience, so little is he a good man, so that those who measure virtue by reward consider nothing to be a virtue except badness. Where is the benefactor if no one acts benevolently for another's sake? Where is the grateful man if even those who are grateful do not respect the person to whom they return a service? Where is sacred friendship if not even the friend himself is loved for himself, with whole heart, as it is said? Even he should be deserted and cast aside when hope of gains and profits has been lost. What more monstrous thing can be said than that? But if friendship should be cultivated for itself, human fellowship, equality, and justice should also be desired for themselves. But if that is not so, there is no justice at all. For the most unjust thing of all is to seek payment for justice. He's, of course, referring here to the type of definition of justice as developed by Thrasymachos or Callicles within the Gorgias dialogue, or the modern British Empire, which has followed the rule of the British Empire, has no permanent friends, only permanent interests. That idea that justice is only based upon what good you can get for yourself, and that your friendship with another is based entirely on what they can get for you and what you can give to them, is actually simply forms of egotistical selfishness masquerading as virtue, which he makes a point should rightly be called badness. And as such, the word loses all meaning. However, if we can learn to love ourselves and love God and love our fellow man accordingly, we will be able to recognize why friendship should be cultivated for itself and for a deeper reason, which is of much more enduring value, and in which state equality, justice, and other things may properly find fertile soil. So a very important idea. And again, his own treatment of Plato's Republic was taken up in the form of his Commonwealth, and he was attempting specifically to awaken a dying republic before he could see it would collapse unto its own selfishness and sin. This was before even Jesus Christ was born, and just a few decades before Rome embraced empire. To be clear, though Rome always had problems, as did the American Republic, there were always hypocrisy and self-contradictions at the very least. During the centuries before Rome became an empire, it was a republic, and before that it was a kingdom for several centuries. Now, as a kingdom and then a republic, it had certain values, certain virtues that were premised more on attempting to create a society that would be capable of meeting the needs of its citizens, that did not engage in betrayal of its allies or unwarranted territorial expansion. And what we see there is an image of Rome on the one side, previous to it becoming an empire, and in purple, Carthage at its largest expanse before the first of the three Punic Wars, wars waged whereby a 200-year peace treaty that had endured between Rome and Carthage came undone. And at that point, Rome began to lose its soul, as Cicero and later St. Augustine identify, by betraying their old ally that together they had worked in partnership at various times to support each other, with Carthage having great seafaring powers and economic powers, while Italy had land power, and together they shared their talents in the defense of each other against such things as the Persian Empire and other conflicts. When Rome began to betray that partnership and instead began to look at territories of Carthage as something it should own instead, to great injustice and for the suffering of justice, it began to lose its mandate of heaven. And there we see Rome at its largest extent territorially, having grown by 117 AD to a vast, vast extent of the known Mediterranean world. And by 390 or 400 in this case, what we see is Rome no longer being able to support itself and having expanded through pillage, through the stupidification of its own people, through bloodlust, games of the Colosseum that was part of the bread and circuses that made people become too engaged and addicted to adrenaline experiences of gladiator matches and Christians being murdered by animals and other people. What we saw was, much like today's Western world, a society that lost its ability to support itself, what one could call the moral fitness to survive. And in order to just survive a little bit longer, the empire was cut into two, with an eastern and western half, the eastern becoming the Byzantine, the western taking on a different destiny. Living through the first wave of Visigoth attacks that sacked Rome, Augustine had written his City of God as an analysis of how Rome came to this point of collapse and calamity. And he writes in notes, citing Cicero as his source and his other research on historiographic literature available to him, saying that after the destruction of Carthage and before Christ's coming, the degradation of traditional morality ceased to be a gradual decline and became a torrential rush. He's referring here to the third of the Punic Wars. Carthage delenda est was the name of the motto, which saw a defeated and surrendered Carthage attempt to have a noble surrender, which was ignored by the leadership of Scipio and other Roman conquerors, who said instead that no, we must destroy and raze to the ground Carthage, destroying and killing all men, many young men as well, who might grow into adulthood with a desire for vengeance. Those young men, those boys had to be killed, and the women taken into slavery with the children. And as Augustine rightfully says, the loss of traditional morality became the gateway towards complete self-destruction and decadence. He also says in his City of God, which was his own iteration of Plato's Republic and Cicero's Commonwealth, he writes, if the values of Christ's teaching had been practiced rather than license, Rome would be prospering. But now there is despair, and even the true Christians must submit to endure the wickedness of an utterly corrupt state, and by that endurance to win themselves a place of glory in that holy and majestic assembly, as we call it, on the heavenly commonwealth, whose law is the will of God. Even though Rome had nominally become Christian, he clearly sees that the overarching morality of the pagan mystery cults, of the degradation of the high priesthood, never disappeared. And without true Christianity, which he always identifies within the book of Matthew, as exemplified by the ability to love God and love yourself and love your fellow man, as the basis of any true foundation of a real relationship to the Bible. If you do not have that, and instead are simply practicing ritual and memorizing text, you cannot be Christian, and you will always suffer the deeper immoral cultural impulses of a decaying society. And the true Christian in that type of world must stand true to themselves and be confident with the immortality of their own soul and the goodness that they are as an instrument in this world and in the next. He also makes a point that the will of God as the basis of the heavenly commonwealth must be the foundation of any blueprint we use if we are going to survive. And if Rome were to actually practice true Christianity, he makes the point, and I believe him, that it would not necessarily have collapsed at all. It was not, so for those who blame, and many pagan citizens of Rome did blame Christianity for the sacking and pillage and collapse of Rome during this time, because they came up with the thesis that the gods were punishing Rome for abandoning polytheism and instead embracing monotheism. And many pagans began to lynch mob and attack Christians like St. Augustine. And he said, no, that's not the reason why this is happening. It's not because the pagan gods, Zeus, are mad at you and punishing you. It's because you brought this on yourself even before Christianity even came into this world. Further on in the City of God, he also writes on justice, following Cicero and Plato earlier. He says, it follows that justice is found where God, the one supreme God, rules an obedient city according to this grace, forbidding sacrifice to any being save himself alone, and where in consequence the soul rules the body in all men who belong to this city and obey God, that is the city of God. And the reason faithfully rules the vices in a lawful system of subordination, so that just as the individual righteous man lives on the basis of faith, which is active in love, so the association or people of righteous men lives on the same basis of faith, active in love, the love with which a man loves God as God ought to be loved, and loves his neighbor as himself. But where this justice does not exist, there is certainly no association of men united by a common sense of right and by a common interest. Therefore, there is no commonwealth. So if we cannot bring about a culture, education, arts, things that actually enhance and cultivate our inner soul, we cannot create individuals who are mature, whose reason is guiding our vices, our tendency to have lusts, to pursue sensual pleasure. If reason is not governing that, then we don't have sovereign people. We have a society of miniature tyrants, incapable of governing themselves and thus incapable of governing their broader society, and thus needing always to be governed by a higher elite class of high priests. No commonwealth. Unfortunately, the world that St. Augustine lives in at the time does not take heed to his important lessons, and we see Rome fall into a deep collapse, whereby various warlord Viking tribes from the kingdom of the Franks, the Merovingians of Clovis, otherwise called the sorcerer kings, who even maintained the status of the sorcerer kings even after Clovis the First nominally became Christian. The Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, the Visigoths, the Gepids, the Vandals, we see they're represented by their various territorial acquisitions after the Western Roman Empire had come into a collapse. And the populations of Rome had collapsed by over 90%. It was disarray, very similar to the Warring States period prior to the Han Dynasty, or the 4 centuries of Warring States in China after the Han Dynasty had collapsed and the Silk Road fell into disarray between 200 AD and the emergence of the Tang Dynasty in 618 AD. very similar process. Whenever, in the case of China, the mandate of heaven was lost, and Confucian principles outlined by Mencius, by Confucius earlier, that were dominant in the Han Dynasty were lost. Those were periods of social decay, division, discord, and turmoil. Whenever those Confucian principles were restored, the meritocratic system was restored, and a concept of the well-being of the self as being premised on the well-being of our neighbors was revived. We saw things like the growth of the Silk Road and the revived Silk Road under the Tang Dynasty. And similarly, the case can be said with the European experience as well. Which brings me to the case of Charlemagne, who has been largely obscured. Who he was, what he did, why he did it, and how he did what he did were all largely written and obscured out of our conventional history books, which is why this features so prominently in much of my work and the works that I used by amazing historians, such as Pierre Baudry, who did much of the work that I found to be of greatest use in how Charlemagne was able to do something very special, following the principles of St. Augustine. So even though St. Augustine had died and Rome collapsed into chaos, within several centuries, Charlemagne, King Charles, as some called him, was able to unify Western Europe once again, and undo the damage of the warring Viking, pagan, mercenary warlords. This he did largely through the success of his brilliant grandfather, Charles Martel, who was then the mayor of Paris, who was an enemy of the Merovingians and was able to overthrow the Merovingian sorcerer kings and create a new dynasty where his son Pepin, the father of Charlemagne, expanded the Carolingian Empire, unified through the Frankish kingdom, the adjacent regions, and grew it to a very large extent. Now, that we have in blue is Charlemagne at his accession, the territory at 768. The territories added before his death in 814 are there in green, and tributary states are in yellow. Now, Charlemagne, one thing about him is he was additionally a grand strategist who followed the advice of leading figures like Alcuin, an Augustinian strategist who was trained in the monastery of Clogmacnois in Ireland, it was known then as a Platonic school of Athens that had taught tradescrafts, arts, astronomy, theology, the transcription of sacred texts. And this was for several centuries an incubator for great philosopher kings and advisors, Alcuin being one of the most prominent, who, after his experience there, went back and led in an Augustinian revival, whereby Charlemagne was able to reorganize the entire economy, declare war in many ways on the nobility of the empire that he had to contend with. He ushered in internal improvements, the training of orphans en masse to learn how to read and to participate in transcribing religious texts and other classics. There was something known as the Carolingian Renaissance, which saw an explosion of population as well as quality of life. New architectural designs were brought about that were sponsored by the state. Renovation of aesthetics into a higher art, Carolingian revolution in architecture. Canals began to be built, roads, internal improvements, and most importantly, peace became a focus of foreign policy, especially when it came to adjacent societies of the Jewish Khazarian or the Muslim Abbasid dynasty of Harun al-Rashid, as well as even the Chinese Tang dynasty on the other side of the world landmass, the Eurasian continent, which was then still reviving and growing the Silk Road. There we have a French painting featuring an homage to Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid, featuring a Christian delegation from Charlemagne's Europe, his courts that went into Baghdad to meet with Harun al-Rashid, and peace deal was signed since there were what are known as ultramontane imperialists among the Vatican within Rome who were attempting to create, even then, in the 800s, 790s, a religious war between Christian and Muslim that would be a forever crusade to take back the Holy Land, which was the argument passed or advanced by Pope Stephen III, which was trying to encourage Charlemagne to go and take back the Holy Land from the pagan Muslims. And Charlemagne, following the advice of Alcuin, had a different idea. And what he did was he essentially brought a peace delegation and Harun al-Rashid on the intermediation of Jewish diplomats who Harun al-Rashid and Charlemagne had used from Khazaria, orchestrated a brilliant maneuver whereby Harun essentially gave the deed to the Holy Land to Charlemagne to say it is yours. We will be your defenders and protect it, and you will own it. And together we don't have to go to war. He also gave Charlemagne gifts of silk and spices and gold, and even an elephant, which Charlemagne had ridden for 20 years until it finally died. And this is a painting celebrating that alliance. There were also Christian, Muslim, Jewish alliances that were established and groomed in the form of the Baghdad Houses of Wisdom, where scholars of all different faiths came together to study the universe and share poetry and translations together. Charlemagne also had an arrangement with the Khazarian kingdom, as did the Muslims. Khazaria, which had only recently become Jewish under King Bulan in around 750, had a very interesting judicial and military system whereby the Supreme Court was run by judges, of which two were Muslim, two were Christian, two were Jewish, and one was pagan. They had no military force unto itself, and so the only military of Khazaria for over a century was Muslim. And the concept there was that the Muslim leadership of Harun al-Rashid's father arranged to provide an army of 5,000 men, protect and live in Khazaria, with the sole exception that they will defend Khazaria at all costs, except under any circumstance that the Jewish kingdom should go to war with the Muslim, in which case that army would turn on the Jewish Khazars, which is a wonderfully creative balance of interests that would be an interesting thought experiment to see how that would apply in our age today, where Muslim Jewish animosity has become so grave. There was another attempt as well to create a special alliance between the Orthodox Byzantine Empire and Charlemagne that peaked with the attempted marriage of Empress Irene the Greek, who was the daughter of a Khazarian and a Leo the Khazar and a Byzantine empress who was a great lover of Plato and the Platonic school. She had agreed to the offering to have a marriage with Charlemagne, and as such avoid the animosity which certain divide to conquer strategists wish to have between Charlemagne and the Byzantine Empire that might have gone to war at various times. This would have been a very important aspect of the broader dynamic of win-win cooperation amongst diverse people and faiths. Unfortunately, Irene, before the marriage could be finalized, was ousted in a palace coup in 802 and died in exile. And this opportunity did not come back for a long time. And I believe this had a lot to do with the ultimate schism of the Western and Eastern churches in the 11th century. Additionally, people will criticize Charlemagne today because he became the founder of the Holy Roman Empire system. Now, the fact is, in my research, there were efforts to make him Holy Roman Emperor for a long time by the Vatican in order to make him an instrument of the Vatican instead of him being his own man. And he avoided that for over 15 years, rejected the offerings to be made Holy Roman Emperor, and it was only on the Christmas of 800 AD that he was tricked by being invited to a celebration in Rome, and upon his appearance in Rome, walked into a ceremony that imposed upon him the title at which he could not reject, although he still attempted to maintain his independence until the day he died in 814. That then creates the foundation, however, of a very dangerous program whereby the power of the spiritual domain and material domain would be ruled over by a high priest class for the benefit of for creating forever wars and keeping society as ignorant as possible much of the time. Although there, as we will see, there were many examples of genuine, platonic, authentic Christians who emerged into powerful positions even within Rome over the centuries and stood in opposition to the evil priesthood that masqueraded as Christian but was never truly Christian and was always still the carryover of the ancient Babylonian mystery cults. That is something we will see further. As I mentioned, the Silk Road, that is the image of it during the Han Dynasty, and that was what was revived in the case of the Tang Dynasty in 680, as it began to be revived, featuring an alliance of different cultures and the sharing of technology, knowledge, culture, as well as spice and material goods between East and West. And as we see, even then, there was an important branch of the Steppe Silk Road that moved through modern day Russia into the area of what became Khazaria, where much of Ukraine exists today, with Western Russia over the Black Sea. And that was one of the key north-south trade routes that extended into Turkey, well, today's Turkey, as well as into Charlemagne's Europe. So this was the type of dynamic of economic cooperation which those heirs of the Roman Empire and the leading patrician families and high priesthood wished to destroy in the form of forever wars of each against all. One of the other key tools to initiate that slide into forever wars was the breaking up of Charlemagne's kingdom in the form of his children or grandchildren. Charles the Bold, Lothar, Louis the German, who the three of them were very small-minded people, not at all philosopher kings as their grandfather and even father had been. They fell under the sway of various geopolitical manipulators from Rome, as well as from Venice, which helped them to come to the arrangement seen here on the screen, known as the Treaty of Verdun of 843 and the Oath of Strasbourg of 842. That Treaty of Verdun carved up the territories of Charlemagne into what is seen there of an East, Middle, and Western grouping of nations, which, under the Oath of Strasbourg, saw Charles and Louis sign a treaty, an oath that agreed that in any case of any future conflict over territorial disputes, the two of them would gather together in an alliance to always fight Lothar, who was in the middle, who had the territory in the middle. And from this, one can understand the origin of what became the borders of the various factionalized states of today's Europe. And one can better appreciate the revanchist dynamics that were planted between different people living in those territories, as we saw with the case of the wars between the French and the Germans over so many centuries, over who would own Silesia, the Ruhr region, and other zones that would periodically move from French to German ownership and always be catalyzer for conflicts. all the way leading up through the Second World War. So, who was behind this? I inferred the influence of Venice, which is featured there along with Genoa, two very powerful city states that for centuries after the Western Roman Empire collapsed took on dominance of the sea trade of the world. You also had city states like Amalfi, which controlled the Isle of Capri, which at various times were competitors, but in reality had a certain type of alliance with each other. And all of these city states of Italy became zones where the leading patrician families took their wealth, their fortune as Western Rome was collapsing and rebuilt, reconstructed the Roman Empire in however way they could, again, utilizing the cover of Christian motifs to obscure the deeper pagan mystery cult religions that were practiced by the leaders of those societies. The religion was one of power and the projection of power over the weak. So, Venice, with the help of certain operations within the Vatican, were able to overthrow and destroy Charlemagne's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, um, Confucian alliance with both Charlemagne's grandkids, but also what became the waves of religious wars, the Crusades, the First Crusade, peaking in 1098, where the Kingdom of Jerusalem was first established, and that endured in various sizes over 250 years of many subsequent crusades, developed a deep animosity between Christians and Muslims. It also resulted or coincided in the rise of the Inquisition, the attack between the Christians also and the Jews, and the creation of new secret or esoteric orders such as the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller that later became the Knights of Malta, as well as the Teutonic Knights and certain Spanish knighthoods as well. These, what we saw during this period, this age of forever wars, also involved crusades into the north of Teutonic Knights being sent to try to destroy the kingdom, Christian kingdom of the new Kiev Rus that had to be destroyed, and that was defended successfully, unlike the case of many Arab kingdoms that did fall to this manipulation. We also had esoteric Arabic orders that were Muslim on the surface, but cult pagan on the inner core, such as the Assassins, the Hashashins, that worked closely with the Templars in assassinating leaders from both Christian and Muslim world, who occasionally created foundations of peace, as Saladin had done the Great in various attempts where he survived assassination attempts and yet still worked to do what Charlemagne had done for Europe, but in the case of the Arab world. So these nations, Genoa and Venice, increasingly greater control over maritime shipping. Venice became even more powerful by the Fourth Crusade that ended in 1204, and which saw the sacking of Constantinople, yet another Christian kingdom that was destroyed by a Venetian-funded and managed crusade under Innocent III, the Pope, that instead of going to the Holy Land, simply destroyed Constantinople, sacked it, stole the gold, killed the men, and paid off the debts by the Crusaders to Venice that had charged a lot of money to use the Venetian boats. So Venice was able to destroy their senior partner. They were typically legally under the Byzantine jurisdiction. However, after this, the Byzantium system became very much weakened, and Venice grew, becoming the senior leader of that empire, replacing Byzantine, and Constantinople suffered some very devastating blows in 1250 and then in the early 15th century, utilizing where Venice was able to direct their hordes of Ottomans in order to, just like the US has used caliphate aspiring ISIS agencies under the Muslim Brotherhood as proxies to destroy and weaken their enemies, whether China or Russia or Iran. So too was at that time the Mongols, the Ottomans, used very often or manipulated to be used as proxies to destroy the enemies of Venice. Keeping in mind that Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, was both himself as well as his father were advisors Ogedai Khan, who carried out much destruction for the world and nearly took control of Europe during a very important moment in the 13th century. And here we have an image showcasing the symbolism of Venice. There on the left is a doge, and on the right is a lion with wings. The doge was the nominal head who was elected by a form of lottery under the control of a committee of three, which itself was influenced by a committee of 11, or influenced in turn the committee of 11, which under that had a senate of only where only the members of royal families were able to become members of the 2,000 person senate. And the doge was wearing what's known as a Phrygian cap, an homage to the Phrygian cults, I believe, of Attis and Cybele, as well as Mithra, that were part of the governing system of the Roman Empire and which went underground after the Roman Empire absorbed Christianity and banned the mystery cults. They did not disappear, but they simply took on new forms. Now, this system was one that also saw the control of bullion, not just shipping and trade routes, but also bullion was under the dominance of the Venetian system. And Venice was a master at intelligence, infrastructure, at creating espionage, embassies that would go into the various courts of the world, all the way to Genghis Khan and beyond, in order to profile leaders and courts and work to induce those targets to become their own enemy. One notable person who exposed this was William Shakespeare, and in his study of Othello, as well as The Merchant of Venice, situates his two plays in Venice and documents the techniques of the Venetian espionage and Venetian psychological operations to get good people who are mentally or emotionally weaker than they should be to become their own enemy and destroy themselves, as was done with the case of Othello, who believed in the Venetian advisor Iago, who induced him to kill his wife and destroy his friends and destroy himself. The case of The Merchant of Venice has its own similar lessons embedded in it, as does Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, which features, not coincidentally, the play within the Isle of Malta, which had just recently become the new headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller, another Gnostic mystery cult masquerading as an order which oversaw the Crusades and was transformed in its name in 1530. So many of these great playwrights are actually exposing and providing political insights and intelligence of operations that would be needed to be understood if the Republican Teutonic faction was to successfully carry out combat against this evil. Some of those notable representatives, which one could come to understand by reading their writings and looking at their political battles as individuals who are fighters in the real world, shapers of laws, include such people as Peter Abelard, the nemesis of Bernard de Clairvaux, the man who was a Cistercian grand strategist who placed two popes on the papacy of the throne of the Vatican, of St. Peter, and who understood the evil of what Bernard de Clairvaux had created through his charter for the Knights Templar, to weaponize Christianity instead of practice true Christianity. So Peter Abelard is a Platonic scholar and somebody working very hard to revive Plato and was punished by being castrated and put in prison for many, many years by Abelard, by Bernard de Clairvaux and the Aristotelian faction that Clairvaux represented at that time, who is right as a man who was born a little later, named Dante Alighieri, who again was a high political official in Florence, a man who, as a cultural warrior and poet, was able to create a unified Italian language as a precondition for an eventual unified Italian state that was to come later. But intellectually, he was also a self-identified Platonist. To the degree he understood Plato, he was utilizing Plato's cosmology. He was in opposition to the Neoplatonists, the mystical Hermeticists and Kabbalists who were working against him. And within his Inferno, his Purgatorio, and his Paradiso, was able to outline the Platonic transformation of a soul that moves from ignorance and personal hell into a state of paradise, whereby a mind that is able to leap over the fires into paradise courageously has self-examined their own folly, their own weaknesses, and has learned how to love justice, has learned how to love the discoveries of the universe, which is why the character of Virgil within his story is engaged in, or not the character of Virgil, the main character of his story is so engaged in hypothesizing what makes the moon bright, what are scientific discoveries and hypotheses which occur under the guidance of Beatrice in Paradise, something which Western cynical nihilists tend to overlook as they focus only on the Inferno, which speaks more to the, I believe, despair within our current age. On the right is a follower of Dante and of Plato and of Augustine by the name of Nicholas of Cusa. Cusa was somebody who was a leading figure who co-organized the Council of Florence that attempted to put an end to the wars between various factions of Christianity and found a healthy, whole, integral Christianity premised around principles of loving your neighbor and loving God. He was an advisor to kings, to generals. Even his student and ally became Pope Pius II, who played a very important role in ushering in legal reforms, both within the Vatican and the mystery cults, and even brought in the war against the witch covens and satanic programs that had emerged during the Dark Ages, where the European population had collapsed, flagellants, end times cults had increased, and witch covens, various satanic groupings and cults had blossomed everywhere, from Switzerland, from the Monte Verita to Italy's Nursia Mountains, where the Apennine Sibyl had become the central command of a big part of the global black mass. And this was what was warred upon by Cusa, by Pius II. Piccolomini was his name. And Nicholas of Cusa was also somebody who had a lot to say about statecraft. And he writes in his De Docta Ignorantia on the nature of the type of society that would need to be created in order to have a durable republic of love and of coexistence. He describes here in 1433, saying that there is in the people a divine seed of virtue by virtue of their common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that all authority which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of all the subjects. This is that divinely ordained marital state of spiritual union based on a lasting harmony by which a commonwealth is guided in the fullness of peace towards eternal bliss. Again, his work on statecraft, as well as his work on science, are interwoven completely, and many of his insights into statecraft as well as into science gave rise to the later works of Leonardo da Vinci, who was a student of Cusa's works. as well as Johannes Kepler, who applied Cusa's method in his own investigation of the heavens that bore the fruit of the three Keplerian planetary laws of motion, and especially the harmonic law that Kepler demonstrated by proving that Plato's hypothesis of the outlined in the Timaeus dialogue 2,000 years earlier of a harmonic, geometrical, and musical set of relationships that are found within a musical string that we build to create an octave and that we identify soulfully as enlivening us to recognize beauty as well as reason is also the same principle at play within the planetary orbits around the sun. And if one reads Kepler's writings, we could see direct references that Kepler makes to Cusa directly. So Cusa is a major player in the development of the nation state as well as of the development of science together, as was Plato. A man who took on this philosophy in the most practical manner in modern history was King Louis XI, who is known and recognized as the official founder of the modern nation state. King Louis XI had written in a letter noting that when justice reigns in a kingdom, the common good is well guarded, and so is the particular. Because justice is such a virtue that maintains a human company and common life, providing that everyone makes a wise use of common things as common and of particular things as particular. Again, he's striving to balance what has typically been kept as irreconcilable principles of the common good and individual good, personal liberty, and the general welfare. Those, from the standpoint of a true Platonist, as Louis XI was, those are not incompatible, but can only be harmonized in the case of a truly mature mind and a truly set of mature emotions, which sees that our freedoms are deeply connected to our duty. They are not freedoms to simply eat whatever we want to eat or have whatever pleasure or sex we wish to have at any given moment. The true freedoms are freedoms that come with responsibility to defend them and that require a cultivation of the emotional state and the aesthetical state to recognize higher beauty, such as we find with a Mozart composition or symphony or a higher form of artistic expression. The joy of discovery, the joy of sharing, the joy of true charity are the higher joys with which a true philosopher king or anybody of that status must aspire towards. And King Louis XI was also a major reformer who saw himself in many ways walking in the traditions of Charlemagne, and who was a legal reformer who punished many of the oligarchs of France and ensured as a peacemaker that the war chests of the French treasury would now be used between 1461 and 1483 as he ruled into internal improvements. We saw a great blossoming again of manufacturing, textiles, internal improvements, and peace agreements with France's neighbors. This also inspired another ally and admirer of Louis XI in the form of Henry VII, the Tudor king, who was advised by Cardinal Morton, another Platonic humanist who trained Thomas More, a man who wrote his Utopia with the idea of reviving Plato's Republic and that insight in the form of what England was facing in the early 16th century. Sorry. Now, the problem here for Louis XI and Henry VII and their many allies around Europe that wished to create a new age of brotherhood and true Christian feeling was the Venetian manipulators, the deep state that had spread itself as fifth columnists within the various courts and political economic systems of Europe that usually were maintained by certain hereditary bloodlines and families from different parts of Europe that were all in alignment with a common philosophy of man must, as a beast, to be ruled over by higher beasts. But what we see from the writings of many of those living in this early period of the Renaissance was a deep awareness of the evil and nature of Venice and Venetian methods, where Cosimo de' Medici described the Venetians, saying, "Association with the Venetians brings two things which have always been rejected by men of wisdom, perdition and disgrace." Ludovico Sforza, another Italian leader of Milan, a lover of the Renaissance, uh, wrote of the Venetians, saying, "The Venetians are obstinate and hardened, always keeping their mouths open to be able to bite off power and usurp the state of all their neighbors, to fulfill the appetite of their souls, to conquer Italy, and then beyond, as did the Romans, thinking to compare themselves to the Romans when their power was at its apex." King Louis XII, the son of Louis XI, wrote of the Venetians, saying, "The Venetians were traitors in human blood, traitors to the Christian faith, who have tacitly divided up the world with the Turks, and who are already planning to throw bridgeheads across the Danube, the Rhine, the Seine, the Tagus, and the Ebro, attempting to reduce Europe, to a province, and to keep it subjugated to their armies." Pope Pius II, Piccolomini, had noted, the friend of Cusa, saying that as among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence, so among human beings, the Venetians are the least just and the least capable of humanity. They are hypocrites. They wish to appear as Christians before the world, but in reality, they never think of God, and except for the state, which they regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred, nothing holy. All law and right may be violated for the sake of power. So again, all of this is happening at a time when you have what is known, these people speaking largely are participating in the creation of a new alliance of warring different states, which became known as the League of Cambrai of 1509. And that league, which involved the participation of Florence, of France, of Milan, of Holy Roman Empire of Maximilian, um, even the Vatican of Julius II, a very corrupt pope, but one who was forced to participate for a period in the League of Cambrai. All of these people who had been induced to fight each other had come together through the good advisors and insightful leaders represented by those voices whom I just read, in order to talk with each other for once and realize that they were all being lied to by the Iagos of Venice, within their courts and within their fifth columnists, who they realized had to be destroyed. And with the League of Cambrai came a military alliance of all of these nations to attack and destroy Venice, which they did in the first assault in 1509, where Venice lost their entire naval fleet, or the majority of their naval fleet, and were begging for some form of surrender, but with full control over their economic controls over the world. And unfortunately, due to a treacherous set of deceits and back channels within the Vatican, Julius II accepted a Venetian bribe, broke up the League of Cambrai, took the Holy Roman Empire with him of Maximilian I, who did whatever the Vatican said. And very soon, by 1510, all of those nations working together found themselves allied with Venice in opposition to France and Florence, which now were being attacked by this Venetian-led League of Cambrai, just showing what an incredible, sophisticated methodology has been utilized by this imperial system that still exerts its influence in the world to this very day. And the world slipped ever more deeply back into forever wars. I would say this leads up very nicely to the Peace of Westphalia and the growth of really the codification of the modern nation state, always keeping in mind Plato's concepts of justice and natural law as the foundation stone for any practically survivable society. The world in which those leading and orchestrating the Peace of Westphalia were living in was ripped apart by religious wars. Before the 30 Years' War that reigned in Germany, that was concentrated in Germany between Protestants and Catholics between 1618 and 1646, there was an earlier set of a 30 Years' War in France, known as the French Religious Wars, where we saw that the French Huguenots were typically Protestants, and you had the Bourbons as one of the leading Catholic factions who were waging forever wars over territorial gains within France, which became highly divided against itself. There we see lands of the Catholic League in green. We see the Huguenot lands in purple, and disputed lands that were the source of so many wars in yellow. There were 8 wars between the Catholics and the Huguenots from 1563 to 1598. And one characteristic is that in many ways it wasn't really religious wars, because we saw many cases where you had Bourbon Catholic Bourbons who used Protestants in Germany as proxies in wars against Spanish Catholic rivals in the Low Countries of today's Netherlands or in Poland. So we saw the case of religion being used for political power projection and not actually at the heart of what made these terrible wasting wars happen. In France, this came to be known as the Little Dark Age. You had earlier, what made this possible was the appearance after the League of Cambrai was destroyed, which conveniently happened at a time that King Henry VII had died a very strange death, probably poisoning, in 1508 at the beginning of the League. His first son and heir to the throne, King Arthur, also died a very strange death around that same time, resulting in a immature, degenerate Henry VIII who had been corrupted by certain courtiers that fed his impulses for sex, his weaknesses, and induced him to ally with Venice against those French and Florentine countries later on. Now, what King Henry VIII had done along the way that was also very useful for those seeking to have forever wars is, in response to the newly created Protestant movement that had emerged under Martin Luther, which gave rise to more religious wars between between Catholic and Protestant. He also created a new church with himself as the head, against the wishes and the advice of Thomas More, whom he killed judiciously, had his head cut off because More saw the trap as he was Chancellor of England and refused to accept the idea of this not just divorce, but really this creation of a new Anglican church, which was done on the advice of certain Venetian agents, such as the grandfather of Oliver Cromwell, in the form of Thomas Cromwell, who was an employee of certain Venetian bankers that is outlined by Webster Tarpley. And the idea of creating this new type of schism only benefited, again, forever wars. Within the early battles, what we saw was the Knights' Revolt. We saw the German Peasants' War, where over 300 Protestant peasants were killed. And it was just a formula for a success of the Dark Age that the empire wished to bring about. Now, I say this ended in 1598, the French religious wars, and this largely ended because of the Edict of Nantes that was overseen by Henry IV, a great reformer king who was walking in the footsteps of Louis XI, and who stated his view that Europe should become a Christian republic, entirely peaceful within itself. The true idea of Augustinian Platonic Christianity in practice as well as in theory that Charlemagne had aspired towards. That Edict of Nantes was an edict of toleration that was extremely, extremely important at removing Lutheranism and Calvinism from the list of heresies and began to create a healing process. He also banned usury, he banned speculation, the high rents he banned, and he started promoting vast internal improvements. And his Alcuin advisor was the figure of Sully, the Duke of Sully, whose name was Maximilien Bethune. And within only 10 years, at his murder in 1610, after only 10 years of these reforms, France's revenues had doubled. So demonstrating the quality of what a true um, cameralist reformer can accomplish when you achieve peace and you direct credit towards internal improvements in the greater good with a focus on peace instead of on war and exploitation. So, like I said, unfortunately, Henry of Navarre was assassinated in 1610, and France again slid into stupidity. But unlike Germany, it had won the ability to be a whole integral nation, which Germany had not had, especially after uh, Otto the First, a great great grandson of Charlemagne in 890, had made a foolish agreement to fully encode the Holy Roman Empire status the way the Vatican wished, as a physical branch of the Vatican on earth, entirely obedient to the Vatican, which was not fully the case before Otto the First. At the same time, what he did is he established prince electors, which means that instead of having a hereditary passing on of authority, which is what most kingdoms had done, he said, we'll make this elected, the status of Holy Roman Emperor. And that those who will be doing the electing will be the duke electors. And those electors became territorial warlords, of which there were over 300, each with their own jurisdictions. And you just see a small image of some of the dominant jurisdictions of what's today's Germany, Austria, some of Poland, in the case of the Holy Roman Empire of the 30 Years' War. Here's another image of the same thing. And Europe after the 30 Years' War saw finally the beginning motions towards a viable, unified Germany with fewer jurisdictions, and that's an extremely important idea. So what put an end to it was partially the organization of Cardinal Mazarin. And what Cardinal Mazarin, a follower of the Duke of Sully and Henry of Navarre, was orchestrating under the case of Louis the 13th and the 14th, he had come to terms with the fact that something needed to change, and we needed to think of a new paradigm of justice and what is our self-interest. It cannot simply be the old paradigm of Hobbesian might makes right, which is resulting in forever egotistical wars of conquest and revenge. So finally, Cardinal Mazarin, after years of diplomatic organizing, was able to bring all of the various participants of this war to agree on a series of treaties, or a series of agreements, of articles within the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. And again, this is what Tony Blair, Kissinger had said we must abolish as we move into a one world government, an age post nation state. And now most people, when they think of, and they're taught about in political science, the Peace of Westphalia, which is taught in political science classes, they're taught that it is simply the first time that nations began to respect each other's right to be left alone. That type of negative interpretation of the right to be left alone is the very opposite of what actually caused the nation state system under Westphalia to become a success, which was not a negative force. It was not an absence of evil. It was a positive force, a principle of expression of agreement to think in terms of love. And much as I have not met in my years any political science student who has actually read the articles of the Treaty of Westphalia, of which Article 1 states explicitly that there shall be a Christian and universal peace and a perpetual, true, and sincere amity between his sacred imperial majesty and his most Christian majesty, as also between all and each of the allies and adherents of his said imperial majesty, the House of Austria and its heirs and successors, but chiefly between the electors, princes, and states of the empire on the one side, and all and each of the allies of his said Christian majesty, and all of the heirs and successors, chiefly between the most serene Queen and Kingdom of Swedenland, the electors respectively, the princes and states of the empire on the other hand, on the other part, that this peace and amity be observed and cultivated with such a sincerity and zeal that each party shall endeavor to procure the benefit, honor, and advantage of the other, that thus on all sides they may see this peace and friendship in the Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France flourish by entertaining a good and faithful neighborhood. The concept of the idea that my well being is premised on the well being of my neighbor, who may have been even my enemy, is a revolutionary idea, and one which finally took practical manifestation in a legal treaty after centuries of simply being an idea philosophically, but not practiced or acted upon in a serious way. Article 2 is also extremely important, whereby the treaty says there shall be on the one side and on the other a perpetual oblivion, amnesty, or pardon of all that has been committed since the beginning of these troubles, in what place or what manner soever the hostilities have been practiced, in such a manner that nobody, under no pretext whatsoever, shall practice any acts of hostility, entertain any enmity, or cause any trouble to each other, that they shall not act or permit to be acted any wrong or injury to any whatsoever, but that all that has passed on the one side and the other, as well before as during the war, in words, writings, and outrageous actions, in violences, hostilities, damages, and expenses, without any respect to persons or things, shall be entirely abolished in such a manner, all that might be demanded of or pretended to by each other on that behalf shall be buried in eternal oblivion. So again, it's nice to say, love thy neighbor and practice accordingly, and that your well-being of your neighbor is based on your well-being of yourself. But unless you can actually truly forgive, you cannot act accordingly. And so this principle was a very important thing to be agreed upon, that we shall learn to simply forgive past transgressions in order to begin to proceed as mature adults in repairing the damage caused by intergenerational conflict. So again, it was nice that all of these officials were able to agree. However, it was not a perfect peace. There was still animosity. As long as it was simply written down only on parchment, there was only so much that could be done, and it was only a matter of time before the war would begin once again. So the way to practically keep it sustainable is through transforming the conditions of life of people with a focus on the future, on their children, their grandchildren that are yet unborn, and creating new capacities by developing schools, by developing missions. And as the Bible says, where there is no mission, the people perish. And such, we see the influence and importance of Cardinal Mazarin's student, his protege, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who rose to become the finance minister of France, the superintendent of the finances, and one of the, if not the most important men for several decades in France, who had a great amount of influence over King Louis XIV, who was a foolish king in so many ways, who saw himself almost as a man god sun king, and had many viciously bad advisors who would flatter his ego and induce him to make very bad decisions. However, he also was not a black and white case and was able to also at different times receive good advice as well. And it was always a battle over who could influence the mind of this king. This is the case with many leaders throughout history who are neither total, uh, who are neither sovereign individual lovers of justice nor are they corrupt evildoers. They often tend to fall in some mixture in between, and such was the case of Louis, who was very much persuaded by the arguments of Cardinal Mazarin when he was a young man and Jean-Baptiste Colbert that France needed to do as much as it could to maintain a peaceful relation with its own people and to assist Germany to have economic development. And so we also see, since France was the only integrated functional country of the time that had learned to overcome its own 30 Years' War, German princes trusted the leadership of France a lot. And that's why France found itself in that important diplomatic position of organizing the Peace of Westphalia, but also the economic reforms that were needed to maintain the peace. So let's go into this a little bit here. For Cardinal Mazarin, once he was made, once he found himself in a position of political power, and that's a painting of him, he began to do several very important things, which were similar to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt had done when he achieved power in 1933, which was a full war to reform the deep state of Washington in the case of Roosevelt, or the case of France, of Mazarin. And here I say Cardinal Mazarin drains the swamp from 1661 to 1666, where he created the Chamber of Justice that had not existed. He ended the buying of public offices that were known as venal offices. He jailed Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of France under Louis XV. I should have said 14th. And in so doing, he proved that this superintendent had paid himself upwards of 6 million. Sorry, not 6 million. He paid himself, um, yeah, upwards of 6 million pounds that were unaccounted for, that were supposed to have gone into internal improvements. Nicolas Fouquet was one of the most. He was like a J.P. Morgan figure of the day, who lived out his days in jail. He audited all of the financial officers and title holders, demonstrating that thousands of titles of nobility were fraudulent. And he forced every person within government, within the nobility, to demonstrate how they acquired their wealth, how they acquired their titles. And many titles were purchased for money. And once you lost your title by having it being proven that it was illegitimately gained, these oligarchs were forced to get normal jobs and begin to pay taxes. They lost their privileges as nobles. He ensured that only governments could collect, the government itself could collect taxes. No longer would the feudal lords be allowed to collect taxes and things of that sort. It was only the government. And he created a 5-year debt moratorium, since the debts were unpayable. There were debtors' prisons. It was destroying the potential productivity of the society, and that had to come undone. I'll also add a few additional things that are just very important to appreciate the level of battle, the drama that had to happen in order for the economic reforms to begin in a positive way. Jean-Baptiste Colbert ended the 1358 Edict of Charles V, where he said that the laws of commerce are made to profit and favor each craft rather than the common good. So that that idea that the laws of commerce are made to profit and favor each craft would have to end. And now instead, all manufacturing as of 1666 would be organized around financing and self-development that would be tied to conceptions pertaining to the greater good. So you wouldn't have textile manufacturers at war with agriculture, which would be at war with um, other trade guilds. You wouldn't have this type of a society at war with itself any longer, which was the case for centuries previous. He also imposed protective tariffs, which means he banned internal private tolls and taxes. He recognized in that sense that much of the productive potential was being destroyed by each of the different feudal barons and lords having control of various waterways. Each one was trying to simply extract money through the use of their land, the roads that people had to move across, or the sea traffic over rivers that commerce had to move through. At each stage, one had to pay dozens or hundreds of tolls, making it economically impossible to develop commerce. So, after many years, Colbert finally ended that. He banned all internally private tolls, which made it incentivized the growth of economic development, entrepreneurialism. As a state, he directed credit in the form of dirigisme, national credit direction for the common good, which began with £5 million from the state treasuries directed towards the development of manufacturing, the building up of machines that could do the work of slaves or feudal serfs, the building up of even schools, where it was done massively. On that note, in 1666, it was the same year that he also created the Royal Academy of Science. He invited all of the greatest scientists, including Christian Huygens and others from the Netherlands and around the world, to come and study and work in France at the Royal Academy. He built the world's largest observatory, which saw the breakthroughs in many fields of astronomy during this period. And he connected science, pure science, with practical industry. So there was an effort to accelerate the pure research and development within the pure science domain with practical applications. And all of this was driven by internal improvements, of which we will say a few more things very soon. He overhauled the bureaucracy, saying that it is necessary to reduce the professions of your subjects as much as possible to those which can be useful to these grand designs. These are agriculture, merchandise, which is the production and distribution of goods, soldiers and sailors. Your Majesty should be working at the same time to diminish gradually and insensibly the number of monks and nuns, the two professions which consume 100,000 of your subjects uselessly are financiers and lawyers. So the monks and nuns were encouraged to begin to become productive, to not simply pray and give prayers to others, but to do that as well as to work to cultivate the soil, to be productive members of the economy. And I enjoy how he targets the lawyers and financiers who are relatively useless overall, which has to find their numbers reduced. He also created a merchant fleet, which grew warships from 20, the beginning of his rule, to 250. And he established job security, training, master's programs. He provided also minimum hours and labor protection and health insurance to employees, the 12,000 employees who would work on the canals that he would oversee and fund. The biggest and most incredible of those canal projects, of which there were many both in France and in Germany and Russia, is the Canal du Midi, sometimes called the Languedoc Canal. And there it is we see in the illustration on the map, which Colbert is showing to King Louis XIV. Indeed, in sum, the canal was the largest infrastructure project of its time. It was 250 kilometers long, cutting, when completed, 3,000 kilometers of journey, of a detour that would normally need to be taken around Spain, which, keep in mind, had additional use since Spain and the Straits of Gibraltar were under the control of Catholic Habsburg Spain. So that efficiency was incredible. There were 130 beautiful, and he specified they must be beautiful, arched bridges along the way. This created also a vastly increased wheat production. New water management systems were created. There were 75 locks built to raise the water 190 meters above sea level. We saw with this the Saint-Thériol Reservoir on the Mont Noir, which was the largest man-made lake ever, the largest man-made reservoir ever. And I mentioned already the workers' rights. This was important since empires have historically managed the world through maritime controls of shipping, whether it's Venice or the British Empire. This is a modern map, but simply by getting everyone to be underdeveloped internally as far as land-based societies, such that everyone would have low economic development, no full spectrum economies, and an addiction to exports and imports over sea trade instead of road and rail, or even internally in this case, before there was rail in the 17th century, there was canal building. This ability of France to break free of their dependency on maritime shipping routes was extremely important by developing internally. These projects, including this one here, the Canal du Midi, had actually been begun by Charlemagne earlier, and even Leonardo da Vinci had attempted to build this, although he was not able to do it in his lifetime. But this was a long time, nearly a millennium, in waiting for this to be completed. And when it was, it connected the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, as I said. And one of the challenging aspects of this was that what we see there are the Canal du Garonne and the Canal du Midi. Now, water flows from the Garonne into the Atlantic, and the Canal du Midi sees water flowing from the Canal du Midi into the Mediterranean. So how was this done? The engineering that was required, the genius was required that needed to solve impossible problems was incredible. But this involved the need to collect 6 million, or to raise, like I said, 6 million cubic meters of water, 190 meters above sea level. There needed to be an accumulation of water sources from dozens of different water sources and rivers and streams, including underground rivers that had to be channeled and brought into a place at the center of these two canals that could become a feeder utilizing gravitational flow of water in both directions. Nothing like this had ever been accomplished before. It was incredible. One thing that's also very important is that this was built through both a cooperative relationship between a private entrepreneur and private companies with a top-down directive by the state. It was not the private company that controlled it. It was simply that it required entrepreneurial initiative, and subsidies were provided to those who had the capacity and the power to accomplish the task. Very different from the PPP, public-private partnership model promoted in our present day. That's a lot of P's. Now, as I mentioned, not only was this done in France, but also Mazarin and Colbert worked very hard to bring these grand designs of economic development to unify Germany and to create hope, durable hope, by transforming the material world and the intellectual world of the Germans with a look towards now the deep future. And among the largest of those projects that are very similar in spirit to what we saw with the New Deal in the United States in the 1930s and 40s were major projects around which thousands of smaller projects were organized. But these larger projects included things like the Vistule River, which moved through Silesia, Mazovia, and East Prussia, discharging into the Black Sea. We had the Oder River projects, discharging into the Baltic Sea. The Elbe River, which is Bohemia to North Sea via Dresden, Magdeburg, and Leipzig. The Weser River through Middle Germany. The Rhine River, which also now moved through which was a development program of new industries, new towns being built up throughout Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, and France. So again, the idea was really think about transforming the world, creating and also creating an opportunity, build new talents, new divisions of labor, new schools that had to be created to promote and to create the educated engineers and specialists, the tradesmen who would go to work in doing this. Um, it was revolutionary. And here's just simply an image of some of those projects which were continued by the figure of Wilhelm Friedrich I, father of Friedrich the Great II, who picked up the slack and advanced many of these projects of Colbert in Germany that are outlined in the graph there above, some of which had taken over 300 years to finally complete. Um, so, yeah, I think that this just demonstrates the essence of practical, material, and metaphysical moral worlds. This is the Rhine-Main-Danube Canal, begun by Colbert, continued by Friedrich I, and only finished a few decades ago. That was another industrial revolutionary project that took so long, 3 centuries to actually finish. And I would say one thing also that's very important on the economic level is that for the Peace of Westphalia to happen practically as part of Mazarin's organizing required, um, as I said, a type of free trade, but not one that was premised on exploitation or a worshiping of the cheapest cost for the advantage only of an elite, which is what we saw with the British Empire and the British East India Company's expansion over the world was through utilizing free trade to induce their target victims to not have regulation, to not have protectionism, and thus to be dominated by an economically more advanced nation as England had become, and that used that to keep everyone else down under the cover of free trade. This is a different idea of free trade, but one that is authentic. And it is expressed in the words of Mazarin, who authored the Treaty at Munster of 1642, saying that from this day forward, along the two banks of the Rhine River and from the adjacent provinces, commerce and transport of goods shall be free of transit for all the inhabitants, and it will no longer be permitted to impose on the Rhine any new toll, open birthright, customs, or taxation of any denomination of any sort whatsoever. So, if the intention was to build up true commerce and industry and positive trusting relations with rivals, you needed to have this type of de-weaponization of commerce. So in this sense, free trade environment would be important. Now, this tradition, this outlook was studied by many of the leading founding fathers of the United States, including this particular genius who plays a big role in my book, The Clash of the Two Americas, and whose work was brought to my attention first by the efforts of Lyndon LaRouche and his associated team of historians at Executive Intelligence Review that began to discover, they first discovered and then began publicizing and researching the works of Hamilton, the tradition he was representing, and who were his followers that shaped all of the positive dynamics of the American court experience, especially under those circumstances where American presidents tended to be murdered. It was always when they were applying a certain type of idea of moral banking and foreign policy that was exemplified by Colbert and Alexander Hamilton. So in his Continentalist, an essay written in 1782, Alexander Hamilton, who becomes the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, wrote of his study of Colbert, saying, "From a different spirit in government, with superior advantages, France was much later in commercial improvements. nor would her trade have been at this time in so prosperous a condition had it not been for the abilities and indefatigable endeavors of the great Colbert. He laid the foundations of the French commerce and taught the way to his successors to enlarge and improve it. The establishment of the woolen manufacture in a kingdom where nature seemed to have denied the means is one among many proofs how much may be effected in favor of commerce by the attention and patronage of a wise administration. The number of useful edicts passed by Louis XIV and since his time, in spite of frequent interruptions from the jealous enmity of Great Britain, has advanced that of France to a degree which has excited the envy and astonishment of its neighbors. And Alexander Hamilton, in the course of his work, even though his life was cut short by an assassin's bullet, did generate and apply the Colbertist method in his reports on the subjects of manufacturers, his report on a national bank, his report on the constitutionality of a national bank, his report on a mint, his report on national credit, and all of his efforts that were done to help the young colony that had been so economically broken after the expensive American Revolutionary War. The colonies, the new states were each individually bankrupt. They were not unified amongst each other. Some had slaves and some did not. Each one was fighting each other. There was no ability to execute taxation or to even levy a protective tariff. There was thus no ability to have a nation. There was really only 13 separate states that were at war with themselves. And so where the debt was impayable, there was hardly any manufacturing. There was only an addiction to energy, labor-intensive agriculture, cotton exports, wheat, tobacco, but industry, textiles were there was very little. So to do that required, in Hamilton's understanding, national constitutional presence in the economy, following the insights he gleaned from studying Colbert. Protectionism, subsidies for productive enterprises, a national bank, transform the state unpayable debts into a new federal debt that could then issue as a credit loans for productive society into things that would also be tied to internal improvements, the building of lighthouses, the building of hospitals and of schools and of canals, like the Erie Canal of the United States, that was even the biggest canal, even bigger than the Canal du Midi, that was transformative and that organized the blossoming of new division of labor. And one of the core points that Alexander Hamilton made is that the British Free Trade School of Adam Smith was promoting the idea of a wealth of nations, but they never defined what made a nation wealthy. It's a purely mathematical, abstract argument that has no bearing in reality. So you first have to think what is required in combat to create wealthy nations, meaning you require state protection, the involvement of but that means you are now running into the danger where the state could be of great power, and as a great power could be abused and used as a tool of influence or control over society, who could become enslaved by a master class. So how do you get out of that trap? Well, this requires what is contained in both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, both of which Alexander Hamilton fought for and defended, which was a defense of the general welfare of the Constitution of 1787 and defense of the unalienable rights, the sacredness of each individual as having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And together, the rights of the individual and the well-being of the society as a whole must be harmonized. And so that requires a culture, an educated culture, a society that encourages the growth of new discoveries, the growth of the mind and the pleasures of the mind. And if you have that, then you can have sovereign citizens, not a singular sovereign giving rights to subjects, but true citizens who were more than subjects. And what we saw within the first 40 years of the young America existing, its population quadrupled. Its quality of life increased by 1630. You had a quadrupling, four times more. It's a huge growth, but an increase of manufacturing productivity that began to seriously challenge even the British Empire. And we saw a continuity of the Colbert legacy in the United States with some of Hamilton's followers, just some of them that are notable of the 19th century, who continued and advanced his fight and his system in the form of Henry Clay. Next to him there, we have Henry C. Carey and Matthew Carey on the bottom left. Two leaders of this, what became known as the American System School of Political Economy. We had John Quincy Adams, the American ambassador to Russia, who worked so hard throughout his life to create positive U.S.-Russian relations, and even the growth of the first railway system in Russia between Moscow and St. Petersburg was brokered in many ways by Quincy Adams and his allies, and Tsar Nicholas I, with the help of George Washington Whistler, who was a lead engineer who built that. He did the same for his vision of a continental rail-driven society in the United States with a good neighbor policy, which was then known as the Monroe Doctrine, that he was the orchestrator of, which was premised not on expanding U.S. influence over the Americas as it has been abused, especially since Theodore Roosevelt, but under the original formulation, it was premised on keeping European empires and oligarchs out of all of the Americas, knowing that all of these empire systems had worked through techniques of intrigue to create forever wars in order to undo the successes of 1776. Now, Quincy Adams, through his foreign policy outlook, was premised on assisting every nation that had been abused by empire to gain the fruits of knowledge, of technology, and of infrastructure growth, which he and his allies had fought for. So again, many people blame him for being the cause of America's embrace of imperialism. They should not. It was in spite of his moral philosophy that this happened. It's the same thing that happens when people blame Charlemagne for the abuses that were done by the powers that were created by Charlemagne, and they see that, oh, Zelensky has been given the Charlemagne Prize for uniting Europe, or Count Coudenhove Kalergi promotes Charlemagne as a great pioneer. These are perversions and co-options of the name without any of the soul or the essence. Finally, on the bottom right-hand side, I included Abraham Lincoln, who was advised by Henry C. Carey and was murdered as well at his time in 1865, but who shared his concept of a society based upon win-win cooperation and a rejection of hereditary powers. He applied, as we'll see in a future lecture, the greenback system of constitutional banking, internal improvements, and a foreign outlook towards friendship and cooperation. The American system Colbertists of the 20th century, some of those 20th century leaders in the United States, all three of whom were murdered, included Franklin Roosevelt, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy, who applied in varying degrees the Colbertist mode, and that expressed by Alexander Hamilton in their own way. In France, some notable figures include the Marquis of Lafayette, who's painted there on the left, Sadi Carnot, the assassinated president of France of 1895, who was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln and this school, who applied it to industrially develop France at that time of crisis. His trusted foreign minister, Gabriel Hanotaux, is featured next to him. And at right is, I believe, one of the most courageous of the followers of Mazarin and Colbert, in the form of Charles de Gaulle. In Russia, there are many, and I could have included so many more, but I just chose for the sake the several faces featured here of the great liberator, Tsar Alexander II, who invited in American advisors and economists and engineers to work together after saving America during its own civil war to assist Russia in applying Lincoln's program involving a protective tariff, um, national directed credit state banks that would be designed to force private investors to have their economic returns tied not to speculation, but to real measurable outcomes in the physical world. The Trans-Siberian Railway just being one of the dominant of the many projects that were built up, especially during the reign of Alexander the Third, and Nicholas the Second, who unfortunately was more confused and didn't realize how he was being sabotaged from within. Dmitry Mendeleev and Sergei Witte were two allies who worked very closely together in applying the American system, as it was known, or the Colbertist system, in Russia's experience. They were both admirers of Friedrich List, the American system German brilliant economist whose works were vastly translated into Russian and studied and applied by these men and their allies. I included here Vladimir Vernadsky, who we will see more of in my lecture series, whose father was a political economic teacher, a political scientist, who translated many of the works of Henry C. Carey and Friedrich List into Russian, and who ran the Constitutional Democrats in Russia. That was what Vernadsky was the leader of before World War I. He was an enemy of the Trotskyists, and he ended up rising to great prominence as the father of Russian nuclear science. He was the founder of Russian biogeochemistry, and throughout his writings, he worked very hard to help people understand the political, economic sphere and its relationship to the moral, philosophical, scientific domain as two sides of the same uh, evolution of our common species into a species of the noosphere, which was not simply utilitarian, it was not transhumanist, as those who have co-opted his language have tried to make it. In his writings, it is explicitly metaphysical and moral as well. It is based upon a noosphere of understanding and moral development. These are not different things in Vernadsky's mind. Although those who came after, like I said, many of them abused his name for their own political, selfish ends. And finally, I know I'll receive some controversial mail for this, but I would include the figure of Joseph Stalin, who also was a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt, an ally who was very sad when Roosevelt died, and he said that the great dream has died. But yet Stalin was somebody who also admired the works of the great nation builders and was a great student of the classics of Cicero, and was always striving to balance economic industrial growth, the harmonization of labor with agriculture, the rich and the poor. He didn't necessarily believe in the Trotskyist view of permanent revolution. He rejected that and instead focused on the concept of make it work in Russia. Let's work to just try to make a system function that eliminates poverty, exploitation, and that transmits justice. And then we can be, as we saw a similar philosophy applied earlier, when John Winthrop, the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had delivered his 1630 City on a Hill speech, saying that America must become an inspiration to the world, a city on a hill which will win the admiration of others, but would not impose our will onto others forcefully. John Quincy Adams had a similar message when he warned that Americans must never go about looking for monsters to destroy, which would turn them into crusading imperialists that would lose the mandate of heaven. And I believe in my research, Stalin's rejection of Trotsky's sick philosophy of global permanent revolution was a continuation of that very same philosophical tradition. In Germany, again, just a few figures that were adopting Lincoln's system and Hamilton's system: Friedrich List on the left, Otto von Bismarck, Walter Rathenau, and Kurt von Schleicher. Rathenau being the foreign minister who had organized the Rapallo Accords of 1922 with the Russians and who was assassinated, destroying the Rapallo Accords at that time after the Treaty of Versailles. Rathenau was his assistant, who a decade later, after the murder of Rathenau, von Schleicher became Chancellor of Germany and began to work with the Friedrich List Society and began to apply the Lautenbach Plan, which in many ways looked like Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, which called for a full reorganization of the German economy and a restoration of the von Bismarck List Colbert program of national credit for internal improvements in parallel to the New Deal happening at that very moment in the United States. Unfortunately, he also was first ousted after an inside job that burnt down the Reichstag, utilizing SS officers masquerading as Jews and communists, which gave Hitler the excuse to declare himself emperor, the Führer, and then very quickly Schleicher and hundreds of other opponents of Hitler were murdered under the Night of the Long Knives. And today, I would say that the spirit of Colbert, of Mazarin, of Augustine is being expressed by the Confucian-led Renaissance that is underway in China and that is manifested in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, of which some of the major arteries are illustrated simply here, both over the land and across the seas, which is creating a new framework of win-win cooperation as a philosophy and is forming the bedrock of the Russia-China, Iran partnership and the broader growing BRICS array of nations, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, which is a partner state but not a full member yet, the UAE, again, Iran, India, and an increasingly growing array of other nations that are participating in this new paradigm. It's not simply an alternative choice of empire. It's a different paradigm of thinking about self-interest, justice, government, human nature, the universe, which is entirely opposed to the very same conceptions of those things animating collapsing transatlantic West. This is, I would say, largely the basis upon which humanity's survival will be contingent. And I'll end here with a small quote from President Xi Jinping from 2019, where he writes, and there's many speeches where he does this beautifully, and Putin actually has quite a few as well that demonstrate a high level of philosophical depth and insight in harmony with those quotes I read earlier of the Platonic humanist movement and those leaders. But Xi Jinping, a Confucian, writes, of the problems confronting the world economy, none can be resolved by a single country alone. We must all put the common good of humanity first, rather than place one's own interest in front of all. I have faith in the bright prospects of China's economic development. China's development, viewed through the lens of history, is an integral part of the lofty cause of human progress. The Chinese civilization has always valued peace under heaven and harmony among nations. Let us all work in that spirit and contribute to an open global economy and to a community with a shared future for mankind. So again, the idea of a harmony in heaven that must mandate and shape the behavior of man-made laws here on earth, outlined by Augustine's City of God, by Cicero's Commonwealth, by Plato's The Laws and Republic, and Gorgias and other writings, by the greatest thinkers around Thomas More and Erasmus, as well as Nicholas of Cusa and Dante Alighieri, and those who applied those conceptions in the form of Louis XI, Henry of Navarre, Henry IV of Navarre, Mazarin, Colbert, and so many of those I've listed, and many more who I did not have time or space to list, express this ongoing principle of humanity made in the living image of the Creator, and the unification, the intersection of the arts, the sciences, and the highest of the sciences, which is the science of happiness, as outlined by Benjamin Franklin in the form of the science of political economy. And that, I believe, when you take into consideration also the works of Lyndon LaRouche, represented by in a living way. I believe the spirit is being maintained well by Sergei Glaziev, a student of Mr. LaRouche's writings and considerations on economics. This is required to be readopted if we are to avoid a new prolonged dark age for all mankind. So, without further ado, I'll wrap up this class, thanking everyone for sharing their time with me and looking forward to continuing this journey in lecture number 6 coming soon.